I use my hands a lot, so I will try to do my best to project my voice. I hate using microphones because I hate my voice on that, so I hope you can hear and enjoy tonight's presentation. So the story is I grew up in Pike, which is a little smaller than Green Bay, just a bit smaller, just northeast of town here. And when I was growing up, I ended up helping out at the local butcher shop. And as small towns will have it, a couple of the local guys would gather in the evenings and sit around and have some libations as the butcher's son Phil and I would be cleaning up the shop. And we would overhear these stories about the moonshiners or the bootleggers every once in a while. And I really thought that was an interesting topic. It was obviously a topic that they would bring up repeatedly. And over the years, got through high school, I went into the Army, I was a medic for 4 years, I got off active duty. I knew I wanted to be a physician assistant. I started my studies at Marion to be a PA, and I figured out pretty quickly that I really like biology, I like healthcare, but I also love history, and that wasn't something that was going to go away. And so Marion being a wonderful place that it is, I was able to sit down with the advisors and I said, hey, is there any way I can do a degree in history but do all the pre-PA stuff? They said it's going to be rough, but you can do it. And that's the route I pursued. The moonshining stuff came up when I started to figure out that nobody had ever written down all these stories that I had been hearing. Nobody had ever really sat down and investigated that time period of this area. Nobody had collected all that oral history that was out there. And then I discovered that I had to do a senior research project. And I thought, what a better topic to do. It's local history, it's something I'm fascinated by, and it certainly incorporates the community I'm from or the area I'm from. So when I originally proposed this to my history mentor, if you will, the professor, she said, that's really interesting, JJ, but you're not going to get anywhere. You should probably just pick a different topic. And being who I am, I just dug my heels in further and said, no, I'll figure this out. So I started making phone calls. I went to the Malone Area Heritage Museum, which is out in another town about the size of Green Bay. And the museum was very much in its infancy at the time. My grandma was very involved at that point. My dad was involved. And I got up at a meeting and I said, hey, some of you probably know me. Every one of you probably know my parents or grandparents. Here's what I'm doing. If you want to talk to me, I'd love to sit down and listen to your story. And with that, I had people coming up to me and saying, yes, I got a story. I've got something for you to listen to. And I started writing them down. I started recording them. I started an oral history project. And as I started building these stories, I started looking at these themes. And then I started looking, well, what was going on in the nation? How did this prohibition thing happen? What was it like in Fond du Lac County in Wisconsin during that time? And then I took kind of what I found in the newspapers, which I used to spend a lot of time in this building. I would sometimes lose track of time, and I would start reading these articles from the 20s and 30s, and I just became fascinated by it. And then I paired it with all the stories that I was hearing as far as oral history went. And it kind of came together as this beautiful project. I published the paper in 2010, and I've been giving a presentation very similar to this since 2010. I've done it at various historical organizations, community organizations, and as I was telling Terry and I told folks last time, it has consistently been the most popular thing that those organizations have done. So thank you for keeping that trend going. I am working on a publication just in the newspaper and the Reporter with one of the reporters there, and kind of getting a few folks that I had interviewed to contribute to that. If any of you have stories from that time period about family members and you'd be interested in talking to her and including a short piece in that article, I'll take your information and pass it on to Sharon. And if there's enough demand, I will gladly come back down here and do another presentation in the future. So tonight we're going to talk about a lot of things, but really what I start out with is, do you have the front lights on?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So when I talk about moonshine and the Holyland, and you talk about Prohibition era, there's a couple of terms and buzzwords that people hear and images that will conjure up. So the first one, if I bring up moonshiners, you might picture this image on your upper left here. This is Popcorn Sutton, probably one of the most infamous moonshiners in the United States. He passed away a few years ago, and he was probably the biggest moonshiner in American history. A lot of folklore about him. And when you think about a moonshiner, you might picture him with his long wispy beard, with his bib overall, smoking his cigarette, out in the Appalachian Mountains with the creek babbling, out at night, watching for the revenuer, the prohibition agent, with his hopper still firing away, churning and bubbling. If you bring up a bootlegger, you might picture this image down here, a Ford vehicle from the 30s loaded down with crates of alcohol, racing down roads at night with their lights off, evading the revenue agent. If I bring up a rum runner, you might picture an image similar to this. The boat sitting off the east coast of the United States or off the Florida coast with their cargo full of booze brought in from Europe and the Caribbean, with their World War I airplane engines used as boat engines to evade the Coast Guard. And when I bring up Prohibition, you might think of this image, and this image is actually very, very telling. It's telling because it kind of captures America's attitude about Prohibition at that time. So a couple of things we'll see. One, we have these two gentlemen pouring out some perfectly good booze. There's a lot of good booze wasted during Prohibition. Likewise, there's a lot of not good booze made and consumed during Prohibition. If we look in the background, we see the local police and authorities either unwilling or unable to do anything. And we'll talk about why that was. And then here we have the prohibition agent always trying to get the great photo op, but rarely looking to get his hands dirty. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about the Holy Land. And the reason I do this at the beginning of the presentation is because I do this for areas that are not familiar with that. And so I actually went to one of these and I started talking about it, and someone said, "Oh, this is really fascinating. You're going to talk about moonshining and bootlegging in Israel." And I thought, okay. So I probably should include some explanation at the beginning of this thing. We'll talk about the early Wisconsin temperance movement, because when we talk about national prohibition going on from 1920 to 1933, if we rewind in American history, what we find out is what happened on a national scale in 1920s and early 30s was exactly what happened in Wisconsin in the 1850s as Wisconsin was defining itself as a state. We'll talk about why did prohibition happen. In the words of Daniel Ockrent, one of the probably leading prohibition historians at this time, he said, how the hell did it happen? How did a country decide that it was a good idea to outlaw alcohol for consumption? So this wasn't something that happened overnight. It was actually almost 100 years in the making by the time that national prohibition started. We'll talk about why did it happen in the Holy Land. We'll look at the mechanics. Mechanically, logistically, how did it take place in the Holy Land? And then finally, I will, of course, share some of my stories that I've collected over time. And then at the end, of course, invite anyone here who has one that they would like to share to share. So, the Holy Land of eastern Wisconsin is an area of Fond du Lac, Calumet, and Sheboygan County that has some very unique features. There's a reason that when I bring up the Holy Land, those of you from the area will picture certain villages, certain towns, a certain geographic area that sometimes gets debated. But essentially, there were three very important factors. One, it was a German area of almost homogeneous German ancestry. It was primarily Roman Catholic, although there were portions of Protestants within the Holy Land. And then usually we picture these small kind of burgs or localized communities. And that directly relates to how the Holy Land was settled. The point being is that each of the communities in the Holy Land identify themselves as individual small communities, but they also identify with a larger part. And the term Holy Land was actually coined in about 1890 in one of the newspapers out of Fond du Lac. So this isn't a term that was invented by my generation or my parents' generation or anyone that is still alive. This was a term that was a trend, area that was noticed back in the late 1800s. This map actually comes from the Wisconsin Cartographers Guild, and it is the history of Wisconsin in maps, if you will. And one of those maps that they chose to include is the Holy Land. And they put a space in here, which is up for debate, but the Holy Land. And here we see a bunch of the communities that we commonly associate with the Holy Land, and some communities that some Holy Landers would argue are not part of the Holy Land. So we see things like Elkhart Lake on here. Some folks might not consider that, but certainly when we look at St. Peter, Mount Calvary, St. Cloud, St. Joe, Johnsburg, Marytown, as well as ones that aren't marked like Calumetville, Pike, those sorts of things. Those are certainly communities that we consider part of the Holy Land. Beth Schlemper is a geographer and somewhat of a historian she's from Wisconsin, did her studies at UW-Madison, she currently teaches in Ohio, and she actually wrote her PhD dissertation on chain migration and the settlement of the Holy Land. So if you're interested in kind of the history of the Holy Land, that is a wonderful piece. It's lengthy, it's a couple hundred pages, but it's a fantastic read about literally how did that population that lived in Germany come to land in this part of Wisconsin and why, and how did that impact what it is today. So this map was included. This is certainly not something that we invented as Holy Landers, but it's something that's recognized on a national and certainly a statewide scale. So the Holy Land as a whole was settled primarily initially in 1830s and 1840s, and then a second wave of immigrants came in the 1860s and 70s. And this is a classic example of chain migration. So initial population came across from Germany, from specifically this area of the Eifel region of Western Germany. They left primarily because it was a hard economic time, poor agriculture. Their farms were failing, and at that time, land was cheap in America, so they chose to leave. There was also some religious pressure on Catholics at the time in Western Germany, so there was kind of a double incentive for them to leave. When they landed in Wisconsin in the 1830s and early 1840s, when they landed in the United States in the 1830s and 40s, Wisconsin was really the western frontier at that time. So this was the area of land that was being unlocked at that time, and this was kind of the frontier. So the Germans started heading west, and they chose to settle here because if any of you have ever gone to Germany and you've kind of fallen asleep on the bus or something and woke up, you kind of agree that there's certainly large portions of Germany that look like eastern Wisconsin. So they found an area that was reasonable to use. They settled primarily on the east side of Lake Winnebago because it had a lot of swamps, marshes, and hardwood forests. So they could drain the marshes and swamps to turn those into fertile fields, which is still very much an agrarian area. And then all the hardwoods could be used to build things like the homes and the sheds and the barns that they would need to really establish themselves, as well as their churches. So it's kind of this perfect storm, and that's why they settled in that area. I always find it a little ironic that when I was searching for a picture or a map that included the Eifel region, I couldn't find anything until I stumbled across this map, and I thought, oh, perfect. And the website was from a windmill farm in Western Germany, because in the Eifel region right now, they have a lot of wind turbines. And if you ever head on up to the Holy Land, guess what you're going to find? So it's kind of this like continuum of history. When I talk about different terms tonight, they have specific meanings, so I just want to kind of review things because sometimes we use them interchangeably. Discovery Channel has done a great job of kind of ruining things for historians of this era with their Moonshiner show. So I'll just cover a few words. So moonshine, it's an illegal white liquor made by distilling from a mash. Well, what's a mash? A mash is a fermented solution made by mixing a sugar source, usually corn sugar. The Holy Land in the 1920s had a lot of sugar beets. So using a sugar source, you can use white granulated sugar, which is common now. Yeast, because yeast eats the sugar and its waste product is ethanol. And then you take that ethanol and you either consume it as is. Most yeast will die between 10 and 20%, and that's why most beers are, a regular beer can be somewhere around there, it's often diluted. And then if you distill it, you kind of condense it or concentrate it to get a more potent liquor. Sometimes flavorings would be added. When the term white lightning is used, that has a specific meaning, just like Mountain Dew. And so Mountain Dew, the soda, is something we all think of as this very sugary liquid, but Mountain Dew is actually a slang code word for moonshine that has a proof, as well as white lightning, as a proof greater than 180 or 190, depending on what part of the country you're in. The reason for that is that back in the day, there were thoughts that there were two types of lightning. There was red lightning and white lightning. If a fire was started by red lightning, you could put that fire out with water. If a fire was started by white lightning, that flame could never be extinguished. If you ever talk to somebody who's taken a pull of something that's about $1.90, what you feel in your belly is never going to stop burning. So, that's where the term white lightning comes from. Mountain Dew comes from the fact that a lot of moonshine is made in the Appalachian Mountains, and moonshine is a clear liquid, and it would appear in the morning, just like the dew, so they called it Mountain Dew. All right. It's all coming together. You can, if you're going to make moonshine, you can take corn and mash it up, and you can add water and yeast to it, and the yeast will convert it, and it makes a sweet-smelling, sweet-tasting mix called sweet mash. You can get a sour mash, and then if you just want to make lots of moonshine, as was very common during Prohibition, you just used purified sugar and added the yeast, and it just made a very, very impure, sort of straightforward chemical reaction, and the taste wouldn't be as good, the side effects would be more significant. A moonshiner is one who performs the actual distilling. The bootlegger is one who transports illegal alcohol by land. The origin of that is back in colonial America. It was illegal to sell alcohol to Native Americans. And at the time, it was fashionable to wear kind of tall, almost knee-high boots. And so bootleggers would hide small containers of alcohol in their boots to go and sell them, so they're called bootleggers. Rum runners, there's really no story there, it's pretty straightforward. But they transport illegal liquor by water. When we look at the history of Prohibition, when we look at the history of alcohol in America, we have kind of different periods of who's regulating distillation, who's regulating ethanol. And so initially, we talk about revenue agents. So revenue agents are part of the IRS or the Treasury Department who are functioning to capture people who are evading paying taxes on their still or their product. During national prohibition, it transitioned to, it wasn't that it was illegal to make alcohol if you didn't pay your taxes, it just became illegal to distill alcohol for consumption. So by that act, you were violating the 18th Amendment. Therefore, you had the Prohibition Bureau that was in charge of capturing people who were trying to evade it. So you have terms like revenue agents and prohibition agents, and depending on what their charge was, what they were supposed to capture the illegal moonshiner for, depended on what their department was. There are thousands of alternate names for moonshine. So I've got a bunch listed here. I talked about the origin of white lightning, Mountain Dew. Elky was a term that was common in eastern Wisconsin at the time to describe something similar to white lightning, so something greater than 180 proof. But Mississippi Holy Water was one that I enjoyed. Radiator whiskey. If anybody offers you that, you politely decline. You say no, I'm good with my vision. We can talk about that too, but so I did this talk for Fond du Lac High School, for New Holstein High School, and I had a big slide right before this one, and I said, kids, this is not an instructional course. Don't look at this slide and get an idea. Now this was before moonshiners came out on Discovery, so now it's a lot easier, but at that time there were a lot of, I could see the gears turning in those young boys' minds, and I thought, I know if I was in that classroom at that age, I'd have an idea too. So, if you're not familiar with how distillation works, it's kind of a neat process. Basically, you take that mash, that fermented solution that took yeast and sugar and water and created something that was, 10 to 20% alcohol, and you start to heat it up. Because of chemistry, which I've tried to forget, although I had to take a lot of, right, John? One of my undergrad buddies is here. Alcohol will boil, will evaporate from that solution faster than water. So you'll get an alcohol-rich steam. And then you direct it through some piping down, and sometimes there's this guy here called a thump keg. Otherwise, that tubing just goes straight in to what's called the worm coil. And you just coil a bunch of tubing, and then you surround that tubing with cold water. and as the alcohol steam travels through, it'll start to condense on the inside of that tubing, and then you have a bucket at the end to collect that product. And so you take something that's, let's say, 10 to 20% alcohol, and you make something that's 40 to 50% alcohol. And there's lots of variations in that, but that's the general process. So enough about that, let's look at the history. So, the whiskey tax. Well, when we look at the to really understand how did Prohibition come about, what has America's attitude relationship been with alcohol over time, we have to understand really at America's infancy, there has been kind of a, hey, we can use this to raise money sort of attitude. So the whiskey tax was passed in 1791, and it was instituted as a temporary tax to help pay off the debt incurred by the federal government during the American Revolution and the War for Independence. So the federal government, specifically Alexander Hamilton, said, look, our nation has a ton of debt after this war, and we can, as they did in England, put a tax on either a still. So if you had a still, depending on how big it was, you paid a tax on it. Or if you were actively stilling all the time, you paid a tax on how much alcohol you produced. And so he said, look, they did this in other countries. It's a great way to raise money. We've got a lot of drinkers here in this country. It'll work. So he proposed it. George Bush, I'll walk away from that. George Washington approved it, and it was, of course, thought of as really just a temporary tax. He said, look, once the debt's paid off, we'll move on from here. And then this became a very common pattern. So after several years, the debt was paid off, the tax was abandoned. People could still, all they wanted, they weren't responsible for paying a tax on it. When the War of 1812 came around, said, hey, it worked last time, let's do it at that time. Abraham Lincoln looked at it as well during the Civil War. It was instituted after the Civil War to help pay off the debt. Worked wonderfully. When the debt was paid off, they got rid of the tax. What it did was made distilling a taxable act. And basically, if you failed to register your still, or you didn't pay your taxes, a revenue agent, someone who was coming after you because you didn't pay your taxes on it, would try to pursue you. Now, as kind of the 18th century, 19th century.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
In that early tax, wasn't there quite a rebellion on the west part of the United States?
Yeah.
And there was military action actually
sent
out to stifle that?
Absolutely. So
I can't remember what the name of that action was.
The Whiskey Rebellion. So the Whiskey Rebellion of 1792 or 3, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head. Basically, Pennsylvania was an area settled by pretty much Scots-Irish, and distillation was a very common practice for them. Primarily because when you had a lot of grain, to transport the grain itself was difficult. It brought upon rodents, it could mold, it could waste. So they would turn that into alcohol that could be used they could transport that a lot easier and they could sell it. So the Scots-Irish were big distillers at that time. They lived in Pennsylvania, and when the whiskey tax came out, it was very unpopular, and they raised a rebellion. And it's the only time in the United States history where the president actually functioned as the commander-in-chief. So George Washington led the Continental Army, or the U.S. Army at that time. The rebellion was crushed after essentially a small skirmish, and at that point it allowed for two things to happen. One, the whiskey tax was here to stay, but it was also really the first act by the federal government to say, look, we are going to make laws, and we are going to enforce them. They are going to stay for as long as the federal government wants them to. So thank you for bringing that up. So as the 19th century, 1800s progressed, there was lots of changes that went on in the United States. And the progressive movement was a portion of the 1800s, early 1900s that had multiple little facets. There was the temperance movement, there was the suffrage movement, there were different portions of the progressive movement. But tonight we'll talk specifically about the temperance movement. And that started in the 1830s, way before we even were talking about national prohibition. And what it really started out as was a movement by primarily churches and women saying, look, there is a lot of alcohol abuse in our country. We need to just kind of, we don't need to get rid of alcohol, but we need to get a better handle on this. These people are dying from it. Families are being mistreated because of diversion of funds from supporting families to alcohol. And so it started as kind of, everything in moderation, folks. And it gained incredible movement into the 1880s when after Reconstruction in the United States, there was more emphasis on a better social kind of climate. The Civil War had ended. There was kind of this attitude of America is moving forward. Let's make things better. And let's talk about reducing alcohol. And as that conversation intensified, it shifted from everything in moderation to we have to get rid of alcohol. It was in some arguments a utopian sort of movement. As time progressed, it became dominated by three major players: the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Sons of Temperance. And these three organizations were very well run, they were very well managed. They had national branches, they had a national kind of center, but then they also had state and local organizations. And they were very well done. They had people that would come in and give these very fiery speeches about the evils of alcohol. People would go to them and they say, oh, that's really, really interesting. I like what they're saying. You know, if we got rid of alcohol, we would solve a lot of problems. And they really focused on purely alcohol in America. They did not become involved in talks about race relations. They did not become involved in the suffrage movement. They said, look, we are going to focus on alcohol in America, and that's what we're going to do. And they were very successful for it. What it eventually became was something rather ugly. It became very much an anti-immigrant, an anti-German, an anti-Catholic, an anti-Semitic, an extremely isolationist group of individuals. Because when they looked at this, there were stereotypes that exist just like today. And they said, look, this alcohol problem is not something America had initially. It's a problem that immigrants brought here. And when, at that time, a significant portion of immigrants were Germans. So they said, well, it's those Germans are always drinking beer. They own all those breweries. It's probably their fault, too. There was a misconception at the time that Germans were Catholic. And so, well, that must be part of the Catholic problem. And then distillation factories or distilleries were owned by generally Jews in America at that time. So it became up, well, this is the Jews. They're exploiting America with their drink, and they're making it harder on Americans. So the temperance movement started out as kind of an innocent thing of saying, look, moderation. And by the end, especially with World War I, because when World War I came about, it was very much, well, the Germans are the enemy. Anything associated with Germany is bad. The brewers did not do themselves any favor at that time, and I'm not talking about the baseball team. The brewers of America, because they were German primarily, really tried to side with Germany initially, and that didn't work out so well for them. So it was kind of this multiple factors coming together, creating kind of a rather ugly movement. And then over time, there was a series of legislative maneuvers within state and federal government that allowed those who were called dries, individuals opposed to alcohol, to gain control over the wets, those who were in favor of alcohol, from having power in Congress. And obviously, as we all know, if you control the seats, you control the votes, you can control what's going to happen with federal funds and with amendments. So how did Prohibition come about? How did it happen? Well, essentially, it started kind of innocently in 1917 with the Lever Act. And this was passed during World War I, and it was kind of a rather logical argument. They, I don't remember exactly who pushed it forward, but they basically said, look, America is entering into World War I. We have a lot of individuals who are going to go, men who are going to go fight over there. We're trying to support our allies, and every time we take food that could be used, grains and whatever foodstuffs that could be used to feed our soldiers, and we turn it into alcohol, we're really diverting from the war effort. So they rather quickly said, look, let's not support the alcohol industry anymore. Let's focus on the war. It was seen as a temporary measure, and really, unless people were going to make alcohol out of chairs and desks, it was probably going to lead to some national prohibition, which it did. With the 18th Amendment was really kind of when things became very solidified and national prohibition came about. So the 18th Amendment, which we'll look at the verbiage in a little bit, passed Congress in 1917. And what happened within Congress was the wets and the dries did a lot of compromising. And basically the wets realized that they were going to lose, but what they got the dries to agree to was that everything would go into effect 1 year after ratification. So the way kind of amendments work is they have to pass Congress, they go out to the states, they have to be ratified by a certain number of states, and then once it's ratified, normally the amendment becomes law. But in this case, it was delayed for 1 year. So actually, the amendment was ratified in 1919, but it didn't go in effect until 1920. Now, the 18th Amendment doesn't have any teeth. It doesn't give any power to the federal or state government to enforce it. So this gentleman here with this finely trimmed mustache is Andrew Volstead. And he was a guy from Arizona, and he said, look, Wayne B. Wheeler, another mustache aficionado here, they got together. Wayne B. Wheeler was the head of the Anti-Saloon League, and he said, look, Mr. Volstead, if you put forward something with a lot of teeth, we will support it. The dries have the votes, though we'll get the federal funding with it. And so the Volstead Act enforces the 18th Amendment, and it was sponsored by Andrew Volstead, supported by Wayne B. Wheeler. And then from a legislative standpoint, the 21st Amendment, which was passed in 1933, signed by FDR, basically repealed the 18th Amendment. What it didn't do was give a lot of power or clarity to the states and local law enforcement. What it allowed states and local legislatures to do is say, look, they said, you need to raise the funds to run your own Prohibition Bureau, and you can enforce this really if you want or if you can afford to. So many states kind of said, look, we don't want anything to do with this, we're not going to fund a Prohibition Department, which left it up to the federal government to do all of the sort of Prohibition enforcement, which, as we'll see, didn't work especially well. So the 18th Amendment here, all the different verbiage. So the key was that they used terms like intoxicating and beverage purposes. So it wasn't illegal to make alcohol because you still needed to make alcohol for industrial purposes. And what this allowed, the other loophole it allowed for was like a 5,000% increase in medicinal whiskey. So it just said, look, you can't make alcohol for beverage purposes, but you can still make it for medicinal purposes, for industrial purposes, which led to lots of siphoning and diversion, if you will. So Wisconsin's temperance movement took place well before this was happening on a national scale. And the key players were the Sons of Temperance, the Yankees, which were the original Wisconsin settlers. If you look back at when Wisconsin was a territory and it was building its population and it's coming to its statehood in the late 1840s, it was primarily New Yorkers and individuals from northeastern United States that settled Wisconsin and developed their constitution and structured our state government. So when you look at how our government is set up in Wisconsin, it's actually more similar to New York's than Illinois'. But the point being is that they were primarily Protestants, and they primarily opposed alcohol from a kind of liberal use, if you will. This was in direct contrast to the German immigrants who were now settling Wisconsin and bringing with them their rich culture of brewing and socializing in beer halls and that sort of celebratory use of alcohol. So you had kind of this setup for a pretty big conflict. And so much so that in the first meeting of the Wisconsin State Senate, that there was a proposition that from the moment Wisconsin is a state, it will be dry. And it was actually pretty hotly debated, obviously because there were portions of the state that were very opposed to this sort of thing. And then there were portions of the state that were called Yankee Land, Racine, Kenosha area, that were very much in favor of it being a dry state. Eventually there was a compromise made, which led to the first sort of, So initially there was a bond system. So if you sold alcohol, you had to carry a $1,000 bond. And if you sold alcohol to someone and they didn't show up for work or they caused damage to property, the person that was damaged by that could come to you as the seller, the proprietor, and they could say, look, I lost $500 because the guy you sold alcohol to ran his horse into my barn. And then I, as the owner, would have to pay them. Well, this didn't work really well for two reasons. Number one, there were no stipulations that it had to be refilled. So if I lost my $1,000 on the first day, I didn't have to refill it for 1 year. Second part was there wasn't really any investigation into this. So if my buddy and I kind of worked something out, suddenly that $1,000 bond is gone and I made $500. So there's a lot of that sort of illegal and unethical sort of thing. So that didn't last very long. It lasted about a year. Passage of the dry bill, the attempt to create a dry Wisconsin led to an incredible amount of violence and riots in Milwaukee. The mayor's mansion was burned. A whole block of Milwaukee was actually burned to the ground because the Germans were rioting so much. So they figured out in the legislature and the government, look, this is a pretty hot issue. We need to figure out something that everybody can agree to. So they basically said, look, it's supply and demand, and we're not going to stop this even if we wanted to. And secondly, with all these Germans here, Wisconsin was really starting to become a powerhouse in the brewing industry. And they said, look, if we make Wisconsin a dry state, we're going to kill this industry that's bringing in a lot of cash for us. So let's just find out something that can work. And what happened was Wisconsin became the first licensing law state. So what we have now, where you have to carry a license and meet certain standards to sell alcohol. Wisconsin was the first state to have that. There was a popular vote in 1853. Basically, the government said, look, what do the people of Wisconsin want? And it was a very unfair vote, but basically that vote said Wisconsin should be dry. And Governor Barr, so the legislator took that kind of popular vote and in 1855 passed what was called a Maine law, basically a law making the entire state dry. And Governor Barstow, in his wisdom, vetoed that, said, no, we're not going to go down there. And that essentially ended the debate. Wisconsin was going to be a licensing law-directed state from that moment forward. So why in the Holy Land? What made this area so unique? And what did we find along the way in regards to research? So there's a couple of things that we have to kind of step back and appreciate about the Holy Land and why Prohibition was so unique during this time period there. So I kind of use these terms macro factors and micro factors. And so macro factors I define as national trends which help predispose Holy Landers to subvert Prohibition, to make moonshine, to be involved in that illegal activity. There's micro factors, and what I define that as is elements in the Holy Land which made it possible. Logistically, how did they do this on a massive scale and not get caught on like an everyday basis? So there's certain things that had to happen on a national scale to motivate the people in the Holy Land to make moonshine. Likewise, there had to be certain things in place to allow them to physically, to logistically do it. And then finally, there's the economic necessity we'll talk about shortly. And then finally, it was a thing to do. It was kind of exciting and wild. So on a macro factor, a national level, Prohibition was very much anti-German, it was anti-Catholic, and it was, well, anti-alcohol. And when we look at the Holy Land at that time, as well as to a degree today, what do we find? Well, we find Germans, we find Catholics, and we find alcohol. Both in a cultural and economic sense. If you look at plot maps and histories of the Holy Land, what you'll find is that, as the stereotype holds, with each little town you had the church, you had a tavern, you had a brewery, you had a cheese factory, you had all these little things, and these little communities survived for a long time as their kind of own little silos. But Holy Landers also saw other members of those communities as, you know, parts of a bigger area. Because when they settled the Holy Land as we know it today, they actually tried to recreate the Eifel region that they had lived in Germany. So the same folks that came over from a small town over there, Pipe if you will, they tried to settle Pipe here. They tried to settle a Johnsburg that was similar to Johnsburg back home. So it was kind of this very unique sort of thing, and each community had a brewery because alcohol was part of their customs and traditions. On a micro factor level, this is probably the most interesting thing that I found, was that you had to have certain elements in place for alcohol to be made on a scale and in a way that it was. So the first thing that existed that was probably the most vital piece was the railroad, because it allowed sugar to come in massive quantities, and it allowed shine to be shipped out if needed in massive quantities as well. we had empty cheese factories. And that doesn't initially sound like something that makes a lot of sense, but when I was interviewing a gentleman, he clarified why it made total sense. And the reason is that when you look at a cheese factory, what you find are large vats, cisterns, you find a lot of pipes, pumps, that sort of thing. If you want to make a lot of alcohol, what do you need? You need large vats and cisterns and pumps and good water source and pipes. And if you're a plumber and you can retrofit a few things, and guys from Chicago can bring in the right elements, it's not that hard to take a cheese factory and turn it into a still. So that element existed. And now you're wondering, well, why were all these cheese factories abandoned? Well, one, it was just as America developed, some cheese factories were abandoned, but a major factor was the start of the agricultural depression in 1921. Stepping back a second, we also have an agrarian society. And so if you are from a farming area or farming community, you know that there's very busy times of the year, and then there's also kind of slower times of the year. If you've got a big German Catholic family, and you've got a bunch of boys, and you don't need all of them to help out during a certain time of the year, you can send a few of them down the road to help at the local still and make some cash. That's what's going to happen. So it was just kind of this perfect little setup. The agricultural depression in 1921 really hit farmers in Wisconsin hard. And that was in direct relation to the inflation of prices during World War I. So World War I came around, food prices went through the roof because they had to fight this war. They were selling to allies in Europe, and so prices were really good. Farmers thought this is wonderful. They took out loans. Banking practices weren't very ethical at the time, although they haven't changed tremendously. And there was some predatory lending, if you will. And so farmers were taking out bigger loans than they could manage. And suddenly what happened was in 1921, shortly after World War I ended, those food prices dropped significantly because there was a surplus of goods. So suddenly all that thought of, oh, I'm going to have all this income and I have all this debt, they weren't able to meet those demands. So many farms went into default. Farmers were hit significantly with that debt burden. And it started what was considered the agricultural depression in 1921. And that didn't really recover until after World War II. 1929, obviously, we think about the Great Depression starting out, and that crippled pretty much everyone in America. So we had the agricultural depression starting in 21. 8 years later, a significant depression starting across the United States, and it created a system where bartering was very common and acceptable and continued well past the end of the Depression, even into the 50s by some people's accounts. So if you had jugs of shine or alcohol, that was a very valuable commodity that could be traded for haircuts, goods, whatever the case may be. And likewise, it took cash and it made it worth gold. It made it absolutely something that was to be prized and held on to. So if you had to pay doctor's bills, you needed to pay that debt, you needed to buy something, you needed cash, and there wasn't a tremendous amount around. But you could get some by working at that still, you could get some by selling alcohol. When we talk about the train, I don't have a good picture of the Holy Land with the train going through it, but if you're not familiar with it, it came from Fond du Lac, went up past St. Peter to the Silica Depot, over to Calvary Station, and through Malone to Calvary Station, off to St. Cloud, and then off to the east. So kind of right through the center of the Holy Land. And it came through on a pretty regular schedule, and it could haul a lot of goods. So what made it typical? Well, they made moonshine and drank it, which was absolutely common across the United States. There was no region, no county that didn't have a still discovered in it during national prohibition. So it was very much typical of Americans at that time. There was pretty much universal dismissal of the 18th Amendment as soon as it was passed. The rich said that that law was for the poor. The poor said, well, the rich control the government. They passed it. It's for them. Immigrants said, well, we're new here. We didn't pass it. It's not for us. Americans at the time said, no, we passed this for the immigrants. And so it became this very much prohibition is for them. And so if people don't really agree to a law or abide by it in huge swaths like that, they're not going to follow it. When you look at histories of prohibition, there's kind of these phases that people will talk about. So the first one is that, okay, this law was passed, we're all going to follow it. And then shortly after, somebody figures out they can make a lot of money on this. So they start making a lot of illegal liquor, they start making a lot of money on it. Suddenly law enforcement says, whoa, 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 hold on, we got to try to crack down on this. They aren't really able to, and then basically the entire area becomes awash with booze. Catholics and Germans on a national scale were very much known to ignore or actively subvert national prohibition. So it was kind of a typical thing. We looked at a national scale, what type of population would we expect to not follow prohibition, which type of population would we expect to actually try to subvert it or go against it. We would expect German Catholics, which we found in the Holy Land. There's a gentleman, this sociologist, I'm not sure, a different one who did history at the time, and he would count how many seconds it took from the moment he stopped at a train depot before he was offered a bottle of booze. And it was, and he has a big graph, it's very interesting in his papers, but he wrote in New Orleans, and it took 17 seconds from the moment he got in the taxi cab. So, it was very common to not be following the law. What made it unique? Well, prior to Prohibition, certainly there were breweries in the Holy Land, but there weren't any distilleries. There's possibly one in the Dotyville area, although I only found kind of a notation of it on a plot map during that time, but I couldn't find any sort of advertisements for it or that sort of thing. There was certainly one in Plymouth area, and they made Crab Orchard whiskey. We'll talk more about that later. But beer was very common in German culture, but not distilled products. During Prohibition, what do we see? Well, we saw an exotic practice of distilling introduced. So there weren't any distilleries before. Suddenly there were many, many, many distilleries. It was conducted on a massive scale. When I did, I looked into other areas of the country when they made moonshine. Outside of the big cities, you did not see massive 36-foot high stills like you found in the barns and the cheese factories of the Holy Land. Very typical. So it was on such a massive scale, as in physically the stills were large, but also that many, many, many people were involved as well. And it arguably resulted in a cultural shift. It was an unlocking of the Holy Land, an expansion of individuals coming in and cultural ideas, that sort of stuff coming in. And likewise, the use of cheese factories, barns, in the style that I'm going to talk about logistically, I haven't been able to find anywhere else. When I emailed Daniel Ockrent about it, he said he didn't recall anyone talking about it like this either. So now I'm going to talk about specific examples that came either from newspaper clippings or from interviews about how did this physically happen. So if you're not familiar with Malone, you don't need a very large map. There is, and at one time it was a booming metropolis when the train went through. And that's what this gray line kind of represents. If there's any train historians, forgive me. But that's kind of where the train went through the middle of town. The train depot was located here. There was an egg co-op there today. There was a granary, that sort of stuff back then. If you travel down the road, this is not Seven Hills Road, this is County W. There was a cheese factory at this intersection. There's still a building and a residence there today. Likewise, back in here, there is no longer a farm, but there was at that time. Likewise, there was a farm right here. Bill Casper grew up in the farm that was located here, and he talked to me about this operation, and it was supported by others I interviewed, as well as some accounts of newspaper articles. So here's how it worked. The train would come in at a certain time each day. It would stop at the train depot, and there'd be a certain car that was unlocked so conveniently. Ford trucks, because Ford trucks had metal wheel rims that could support very heavy loads, were backed up to that car. It was open, and the sugar that was in that car was unloaded until the train started to pull away. As soon as the train started to pull away, they closed the door. They got in their trucks and they traveled down this road to this cheese factory. In that cheese factory, there was, if you went in the main entrance, one vat of actual cheese being cheesed, if you will. But there was a false wall. And behind that false wall were two large vats that always had several hundred gallons of mash brewing. And during that time, once that mash was ready, it would sit there and the business continued on as a front, as it was. And when that mash was ready, it was transported along a trail that went along through this field to this barn. And in that barn, on the parlor level, you would walk in and the cows were in there. There was nothing suspicious. If you went upstairs through the common entrance, there was a mow with hay in it. Again, nothing suspicious. But behind a large false wall was a very large still. And that's where the moonshine was made. So the mash was transported from here over to here, and that's where the distillation actually took place. When it was ready to go, it was transported up and down the road and away it went. So when we looked at how did people convert their barns into stills, there were two major ways. One was the false maw way, in which Bill Casper described on that farm there. Likewise, there were situations where they would actually tear out the floorboards of the mow and make a very large, tall column still in there. Now, if you're going to do that, there's a couple of things that have to happen. One, you need to keep some cows around to make it look like a farm is actually running. Second part that they would do is they would wrap the entire inside of the barn in cardboard or tar paper or whatever they could. So if you ever go up to a barn, you'll see that there's little cracks in between. And since most of the stilling took place at night, they needed lights on the inside and they'd have a flame going. So if you were driving by and all of a sudden there was a barn all lit up, you'd either A, think it was on fire, or B, think that something was not going so well that evening. So they would wrap the inside of the barns to prevent any light from escaping, thus thwarting any investigations. When I step back to the Malone operation, there's one key part I failed to mention. There was a lookout who sat along here, which is now Silica Road, and he had a long string that traveled back to the barn. And that barn had a large bell in it with a string attached to it. And when the lookout was sitting out there, if he saw a car coming down that looked suspicious, he would pull on that string, it would ring the bell in the barn, and the guys who were running the still knew to put things out and run off. Now on one scenario, one day, the lookout was Louis Carls, and he had done this for a while before, but he was busted. He was ambushed by the police, and he was shot in the back. He survived, and was taken to the hospital here in Fond du Lac. In his interview, he says, 2 days later I walked out, because, well, patients still do that today. I can tell you that as a PA. Don't do that, please check with the nurses first. So he walked out 2 days later, and 2 years later he got a fine, he paid it, and it was as though nothing happened. This wasn't Louis' first time running into trouble as far as moonshining went. So when I was starting this project, I would interview people, and this name would come up. Say, if Louis Carls was alive, he could tell you everything you ever needed to know, and it's, wish he was alive. But he had died many years ago. So I just kind of went on and okay, whatever. Well, then one day at the Malone Museum, a lady came up to me and she